These are the stories
My little girl, she's changing lives just by being herself.
of organizations and people making a difference.
When you first tell someone about adaptive wheelchair boxing, it doesn't sound real.
And empowering others
It saved my life. It saved my life.
across Canada
I scored my first goal in my first blind hockey game.
in our community. Once upon a time, disability rights activist and published author Amanda Leduc decided to challenge the fairy tale status quo.
There's a very clear assumption in culture, in Western culture especially, that princesses belong with a happy ending. And there's been this very entrenched idea that disability is synonymous with an unhappy ending. I think it's really time that we need to get beyond that. Like, we really need to start questioning what a happy ending is made of. It contributes to this idea that, you know, the world is built in one very particular way. The world is one very particular box that people have to learn how to fit into. And the reality is that, you know, that one-size-fits-all box that we use in society and culture doesn't actually fit everybody, right? A lot of people have to contort themselves in various ways in order to fit into that box.
Over the past few years, Amanda's been coming to terms with her own efforts to fit into that box.
I've been disabled my whole life. I have cerebral palsy, and I've had it since I was very, very young. Because I also have a lot of able-bodied privilege, I pretended for a long time that I wasn't disabled because I wanted to show to everyone that, you know, I could work just as hard as the next person and I could do what was required of me, because the fear was that I would be left out because of the way that I walked and because of, you know, certain health things, needing to sleep a lot more than, you know, other employees or things like that. And so I came to disability activism a little bit late. I'm almost 40 now, and I'd say probably within the last 5-6 years is when I really started to concentrate my storytelling in this arena.
As Amanda has grown on her journey through disability rights activism, many of her realizations and discoveries formed her thoughts in the writing of her nonfiction book, Disfigured, on fairy tales, disability, and making space.
It would have been different if I had read stories, you know, when I was younger, feeling like, okay, there's definitely a place for me in the world. I didn't really read something that struck me in that way. And I think in many ways, my book Disfigured was written because I didn't have that experience. Like, this was the book that I would have loved to have read when I was in my teens. I think it would have changed a lot of things for me.
Deborah Dundas is the book's editor at the Toronto Star. It was these kinds of issues that inspired her to try and put concrete numbers to the diversity present in Canadian children's books.
I decided to do the survey because I'd been seeing a lot on social media about people wondering how kids are portrayed in books in Canada. So there was nobody measuring that. And I thought, well, the cries kept getting louder and louder, and I thought, well, I can probably do something about that. There was in the United States an organization that measured those statistics already, and so they had clearly laid out who was represented in terms of race, in terms of whether they were LGBTQ, whether the characters were disabled, whether visibly disabled or invisibly disabled.
Within Canada and its publishing industry, it's a much different story.
They didn't know who was portrayed in books and how they were portrayed. Who was writing these books, whether, you know, if there was a black character in a book, whether it was from a white writer who decided to put a black character in the book, or whether it was actually a black person saying, this is how, you know, this is my person and this is how they should be portrayed.
Her survey was sent to 46 publishers across the country who self-reported on the diversity in their recently published books.
So we got a sense of who was telling the stories and what stories were being told. Overall, we found that the reflection of diversity wasn't all that great. Characters with disabilities, whether visible or invisible, were very poorly represented. That was across all categories, whether it was books for young kids, picture books, whether it was for middle grade books or whether it was for young adult books. 2% of books actually showed characters or reflected characters that were disabled in some way, when 22% of the population actually identifies as disabled. So that's a very poor representation.
With 44 years in the business, Margie Wolf knows all too well the issues within the publishing industry.
It's about ignorance. It's all about ignorance. And our unwillingness to think beyond what we already know. I mean, part of the reason that I exist as a publisher is that I do human rights, social justice books. It's about pointing out, in many ways, what situations are for people and showing, think about this.
Her company, Second Story Press, has been publishing a diverse selection of books since its creation in 1988.
We started doing it mostly for adults, but now we do it for kids in a huge, huge way. And it's taken our books around the world. We have Second Story books, because not a lot of people do those kinds of books, have been translated in close to 50 languages. These stories really give us a sense of what is possible. Sorry, that's not true. It's not what is possible, what is real. It's what is going on now. A lot of people just don't know it. Today, more than ever, our books are reflected in the news around women's issues, Indigenous books. We did a residential school book 5 or 6 years ago before Truth and Reconciliation.
But while certain books and topics are seeing an increase in demand, the same cannot be said for disabilities.
We just did a book about 10 women who were surgeons, leaders, that kind of thing, all with disabilities. But nobody knows anything about them. You sometimes see a disabled character as a tertiary figure or secondary character rather than as a primary character, rather as the heroine of the story. Because again, people with disabilities are not understood in that kind of way. You have to turn our understanding on its head and say, so what makes a heroine? What is it that's special? What is it that we need to value? Like all children, children with disabilities need to see themselves in the literature.
And now I'm going to talk about King for a Day.
Ruxana Khan's King for a Day is one of the rare children's books that features a main character with a disability. Today, she's giving a webinar on the story, which follows a young boy during the Pakistani kite festival of Basant.
You can see that this boy, his name is Malik, which means king. He's in a wheelchair. I wanted to show that this boy has his abilities and his disabilities. Just because he has a disability doesn't mean he's not abled, okay? He has abilities as well. And I want to focus on his abilities. That was the point of the story. An editor asked me to take out the disability. What the editor said is that, more kids would be able to identify with him if he's not disabled. And I thought, look, wait a minute. We all have abilities and we have disabilities. My brother asked, Malik, is that all you made? My sister says, how can you be king of Basant with only one kite? It's called Falcon. Inshallah, it will be fast enough in some country. It means if God wills.
Like Ruxana, Margie Wolf and Amanda Leduc have both struggled against the idea that books featuring diverse characters are niche topics.
The assumption is that only disabled people read or are interested in stories by disabled people. And that's not true. I really, push for publishers and other outlets really to understand that, disabled stories are not just for disabled people, they're for everybody. In an ideal world, there would be space for everybody and we would understand that everyone has a valid story to tell and that they're all equally important. And we don't live in that world right now, and so we're still working to get there.
Our Community will return after the break. We now return to Our Community.
There's the bully next door. Ha!
Ruxana Khan is currently doing a webinar on King for a Day, her children's book that follows a boy in a wheelchair during Pakistan's most popular kite festival.
His kite is so big, I nickname it Goliath. You know, the kids actually don't care about the disability as much as adults tend to. A lot of the reviewers made comment that, hey, it's not in the text that he's disabled. And I thought, yeah, exactly. His disability is not the point. And most people from the margins, we don't want our disability to be the point. We want our ability to be the point. We want the things that we can do to shine. On the count of 3, my sister jumps. I tug on the string. Falcon leaps into the sky. I'm ready to attack. We're all kings in our own way.
For Amanda, Disfigured was the book where her own personal experiences of living with cerebral palsy came to the forefront.
That one obviously is very overtly about disability and fairy tales, and that one kind of became a bit of almost a manifesto. And part of that book was also my personal story, so there's lots of memoir woven into it, looking back at my life as a disabled child and how certain things about the ways that I was treated had a very real part to play in how I saw myself as a disabled person.
But while the book has become a success for Amanda, even being translated into other languages, the idea for it came unexpectedly. As with so many fairy tales, it was on a walk in the forest during a retreat that the idea arrived.
Suddenly I realized that even though physically the forest keeps disabled people out, in the kind of magical mental realm where we think of the forest as a fairy tale landscape, it actually includes a lot of disabled people because there are a lot of disabled people in fairy tales. It's just that they are often the villains in the stories. I was just fascinated by all of this, and I figured I would initially write an essay and just started doing research for it, and I realized there wasn't actually a lot out there. And then it just grew and grew and grew and eventually became a book.
Although Amanda was initially inspired by fairy tales, this trope of disabled characters being villains is present across all kinds of stories.
It's a very easy shorthand, right? Someone who is evil has a scar on their face, or they have a different colored, hair, or they just look different in some way. Scar, the villain in The Lion King, he has an actual scar across his face. And you see that in fairy tales with things like, the Wicked Witch who disguises herself, right, as an ugly, hunchbacked old woman in one of the Brothers Grimm versions of the tale. And the idea there is that, she's disguising herself in such a way that Snow White thinks that she means no harm because, an old woman wouldn't mean any harm at all. Or, the story of Rumpelstiltskin, who is an ugly hunchback dwarf, quote unquote, in the tale. And he, the princess is sort of disgusted by him. We have to think about a version of the world that's bigger. Because ultimately what that comes down to is a lack of imagination, right? You only see happiness or you only see a worthwhile life when it looks a very particular way. And that's quite sad in some ways because no life looks one particular way, right?
Expanding the definition of what makes a joyful life is a theme explored throughout many of the books that Margie Wolf publishes at Second Story Press.
When I started doing the kind of publishing that I do, books for and about people with disability, and ideally by people with disabilities, was natural. And we did a book the first year we started publishing in 1989, and we continued doing them in 2021. We have a recent book by a woman with Down syndrome. She does beautiful, beautiful art. And when we saw it, we thought, we think we can turn some of this art to show what a joyous, fulfilling life she has. She, and together with Second Story, developed a storyline that looked at her daily life through images she created. And again, it doesn't show a pathetic person you need to feel sorry for. She has part-time job, she does yoga, she can do sign language, She travels on the bus, public transit, and wow, she's terrific. And I think, again, we have all kinds of stupid and dumb stereotypes about what it means to have Down syndrome. And this creates an entirely different picture. We've done several books with the deaf community, and there's a terrific story about two women who, house painters. So they're doing two colors, and they're painting this place, and they're having such a good time talking to each other that they don't notice that they're sprinkling paint on the walls as they're talking, and they turn these yellow and black walls that they've created.
Margie believes it's especially important for publishers to be willing to broaden their own perspectives.
If we are going to create a diverse literature for people, we have to look more broadly than what we know. But it is a willingness to go beyond the limits of what you're already aware of.
Our Community will return after the break. We now return to Our Community. Whether writing about everyday heroes or her own Pakistani heritage, children's author Rukhsana Khan is committed to crafting stories that show different points of view.
I think we're so used to a certain type of look for a hero, a certain aesthetic, that we don't think of stories that can make heroes of people from the margins. And disabled people are definitely on the margins. And I know all about that because I'm on the margins too. As a Muslim woman, I'm on the margins of society. And that's what I try to do with a lot of my stories, is to show the life at the edge of the margins, because it can be really interesting. When you're marginalized, you're forced to dig deeper. You're forced to look at society in a different way and to come to different realizations. And there are things that mainstream society can learn from the marginalized. It's not just a one-way street where we're supposed to take on mainstream values and they don't learn anything from us. It actually should be a dialogue. It should be a two-way street.
For over 30 years, Margie Wolf has been dedicated to publishing more and more of these important lessons.
I believe literature can be a social force, and my job is to help create and make sure that literature gets out into the world and to the community. It's just a small piece, but I believe publishers like me have a social responsibility, and dealing with issues of disability is part of it.
As she surveyed Canadian children's book publishers and listened to advocates, Deborah Dundas discovered that the lack of diversity in stories affects children at a fundamental level.
It's so important for kids to see themselves represented in the books they read, because it says to them, my story is important. It says, I'm important. And so they grow up feeling that they have a place in the world. Seeing yourself in a book validates you.
As the industry slowly changes, Deborah hopes more and more disabled writers will finally be heard.
My advice to new writers would be, tell your stories. There are more places out there that are wanting to hear them. There are more literary journals out there that are willing to publish, to get your first byline out there, to get your first story done. And I would really recommend people embrace what's out there and demand a voice for yourself, demand a place for yourself.
When it comes to disability representation, Amanda Leduc believes the answer is more inclusion.
We need to involve disabled people in every element of storytelling. So disabled people need to be advisors on television shows. They need to be advisors for books. They need to be advisors for movies. And they also need to be included on the camera in a way that that normalizes, right?
It's not just about the stories we tell, though. For Amanda, changing our stories is the first step to changing our world.
We have been taught, because of the stories that we tell, about disability and have told up until this point that, disability is this very sort of hard, difficult thing that, people struggle with. And we can tell different stories about that. Disability can be hard, and it can be something that we struggle with, but it is something we struggle with in large part because of how society is built. If we recognize that there are all kinds of different people in the world right from when we're very young, and that the world has a responsibility to meet all of those needs in some way, then we can do our part to work toward that world.
In the end, expanding the kinds of stories we tell will allow everyone to find their own unique version of happily ever after.
The happy ending, such as it is absolutely attainable. But that happy ending is also a complicated happy ending, right? Because it's a complicated happy ending for everybody. We live lives that are full of joy and also full of sadness and full of grief at the same time. And to deny someone the fullness of that experience simply because they look a different way or they walk a different way or they just occupied space in a different way, it makes no sense at all. When I tell stories, I want people who are disabled in the same way that I am and people who have other disabilities to understand that there's no one way to be in the world, right? All stories are valuable and important and mean something to somebody. All of the stories that we tell can connect with someone else.
Produced and directed by Tim Alp. Writer and story editor Maureen Carter. Narrator Jim Van Horn. Director of photography Stefan Szymanski. Camera operator Stefan Szymanski, Tim Alp. Location audio Brian Mellersh. Production manager Riley Alp. Editor John Curtin. Assistant editor Kevin Burton. Integrated Describe video specialist Simone Cupid. Graphics Andrew Antonello. Content development specialist Karen McGee. Coordinating producer Jennifer Johnson. Director production Karen I. Director Programming Brian Perdue, VP Content Development and Programming John Melville, President and CEO David Arrington. Produced for AMI by Mountain Road Productions. Copyright 2022, Accessible Media Inc.